Welcome, everyone. Welcome. My name is Todd Ramon Ochoa. I'm Associate Professor of Religion in the Department of Religious Studies here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It's my pleasure to be your host today for Expecting Armageddon, What the Book of Revelation Reveals, a live talk and question and answer with my colleague, Bart D. Ehrman. It is wonderful to see you all coming in now. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you and your families are healthy as the COVID-19 pandemic continues around the world. We're streaming both on Zoom and live on Bart's YouTube channel. For those who are connecting via Zoom, I want to orient you to a couple of buttons at the bottom of your Zoom window. The chat button in the middle toward the left at the bottom is for communicating with me and one another during this event. I will mostly use the chat function to send you links to information we want to share with you. It's not the ideal channel for questions for Bart because the chat tends to move fast and questions are easily lost. So for questions you'd like to ask Bart, you want to use the question and answer button at the bottom of the Zoom window in the middle, but toward the right. I will monitor the Q&A, and at the end of Bart's talk, your questions there will guide our conversation. For those of you on YouTube Live, if you have questions, please drop those in the comments. I see there's a lot of chat on YouTube Live right now. I can't promise to monitor those as closely, but I'll try. After Bart is finished with his talk, I'll return for the question and answer period. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Bart D. Ehrman, the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where Bart has taught since 1988. Professor Ehrman has written or edited 33 books in the fields of New Testament and early Christianity, including 6 New York Times bestsellers. He's also recorded 8 lecture courses for the Great Courses by the Teaching Company. He has more than 2 million copies of his books and lectures as courses that have been sold. And his books have been translated into 27 languages. Bart, thank you for being with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This is, I'm really glad to do this event. This event, as you know, is it's a fundraiser for our department, not the department generally, but it's a fundraiser for the graduate students in our department, specifically to a fund that helps our graduate students learn better how to teach. We put a very special emphasis in our department on training our students to communicate. We see this as an incredibly important aspect of graduate training. When I was in graduate school, that was not the case so much. we were going off to get positions teaching, but basically, you know, they didn't teach us how to teach. And so it's kind of hit and miss whether you knew how to do it or not. We take it very seriously. We train our students how to communicate. Many of them, most of them will be getting jobs teaching 19 and 20-year-olds. That's a task if you don't know how to do it. And many of our students go on then to have careers where they also involve public speaking, much as I try to do as well. We are using the funds that we raise from this fundraiser to go into our a particular graduate student fund, the Bill Peck Fund. Bill Peck was one of our great teachers, a very well-known and popular teacher back in the 1960s and 70s, and he's no longer on the faculty, but he is still with us and very involved with the sorts of things we do. And to honor him, we set up this fund. We hope that all of you can make a donation to this fund. That's the purpose of this lecture. You're not required to. You don't have to. It's open to anybody. But if you could make a donation, we'd really very much appreciate it. The suggested amount is $10, but we accept any amount. The sky is the limit. As possibly an additional perk, the highest donor, I'm going to have a one-on-one with whoever it is, whatever the highest amount donated is. I'll just have a 30-minute one-on-one to talk about anything that person wants to talk about, if anything they want to talk about. So the current highest donation is $500. If you are interested in having a one-on-one with me, that we would set up a mutually agreeable time and do it over Zoom, then unless you're in my neighborhood, in which case we could get a cup of coffee or whatever. If you're interested in that, go ahead and make the donation. It's very easy to make these donations. You'll have the link on the invitation that you got here on the blog. On the Zoom. So I'm going to get into my lecture now. Let me say a little bit of background before I get into it. This lecture is on the book of Revelation. This is a book I've been interested in since I was basically 17 years old, and I've studied in a number of different contexts, starting out when I was very committed as an evangelical Christian to the Bible, and I studied it a certain way in that context. And over time, I developed my views and developed my scholarship, and now I have different views about the book of Revelation and the entire Bible. And this is the topic of the current book that I'm writing. I'm writing now a book for a general audience, not for scholars, but for a general audience, dealing with the book of Revelation and in fact what it actually reveals. The tentative title for the book is the one that is the tentative title for this event, Expecting Armageddon. At the end of my talk, my idea is to talk for about 50 minutes or so, and then I will be taking questions. You can do the questions on the Q&A, as Todd said. He will be going through those questions, and we'll pick a few for me to answer. I won't be able to answer a lot of them. I am trying, though, to I'm trying to answer. I'm trying to get this in within 50 minutes, and then take the rest of the time to answer questions. Hopefully, that will go to about 3:30 or so. So I am sharing my screen now, and I hope you can see it. This is my talk on Expecting Armageddon. What does Revelation reveal? I'm going to begin with a bit of an anecdote of something that happened when I moved to Chapel Hill in 1988. I had been teaching at Rutgers University for several years in New Jersey. And I'd spent 10 years in New Jersey altogether. I went to Princeton Theological Seminary and did a master's degree there and a PhD there. Then I started teaching at Rutgers. When I moved to North Carolina, I knew I was moving to the South. And I knew that my students were going to be very different from students I had in New Jersey in many ways. I knew I was moving to the Bible Belt. New Jersey is not in the Bible Belt. And so I expected things to be a little bit different. I was not really expecting, though, when I arrived in August of 1988, to start getting phone calls from the local newspaper about whether Jesus was coming back sometime next month. I got calls. Journalists had heard that there was this book in circulation arguing that Jesus was to return in September of 1988, and they wanted me to know from me as a Bible scholar if that was right. I had no idea what they were talking about. And so I looked around and I realized there is a book. There was a book. There was a book written by a man named Edgar Weissnant that was called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Occur in 1988. 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Occur in 1988. Now, in case you don't know what this lingo, the rapture is the teaching in very conservative evangelical and fundamentalist circles that Jesus is soon going to return, and he's going to take the believers in him out of this world before there's a 7-year tribulation on earth when literally all hell breaks out. The Antichrist arises, takes over the world. There's horrible suffering, massive wars, and basically the world's going to blow itself up. And right before it happens, Jesus then comes back and stops it and brings in the kingdom of God, destroys the enemies of God and brings in his own kingdom. That is all, that tribulation and that near destruction of the world is all preceded by the rapture. The rapture, the term rapture does not ever occur in the New Testament, by the way, or in the Bible. And this idea that Jesus taking his people out of the world is a problematic idea, but it's a very common idea in evangelical circles, especially conservative evangelical and fundamentalist circles. And Edgar Whisenant said that he knew when it was going to happen. He wrote this book. He, by the way, was a bright guy. He was a rocket engineer for NASA before he started writing books about when Jesus was coming back. In this book, Whisenant gave 88 reasons why this was going to happen during the festival of Rosh Hashanah toward the end of September in 1988, September 24th to 28th. It's going to happen sometime during that week. Whisenant had 88 biblical and sort of philosophical reasons why it had to happen then. So just to give you an idea of how he had this worked out. One of his examples is a very interesting one. It's a passage that if you're familiar with the Bible, this will sound familiar. It's this passage in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew chapter 25. Jesus is telling his disciples what is going to happen at the end of the world. And he explains how the sun will turn dark and the moon turn to blood, and stars will be falling from the sky, and all chaos is going to break out. And his disciples want to know. They say, well, Lord, when is this going to happen? And Jesus says, learn a lesson from the fig tree. Just as when the fig tree puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So too, when these things take place, you know that the end is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. That's in Matthew 25, and Whisenant uses it to show when Jesus is coming back, and he has a really interesting argument. The parable begins with a fig tree. What is the fig tree? Well, in the Bible, the fig tree is often a symbol for the nation of Israel. Okay, the fig tree puts forth its leaves. What does that mean? Well, the fig tree has lain dormant over the winter and has seemed to be dead, and it puts forth its leaves when it comes back to life. So the question is, when does Israel come back to life? Well, Israel became a sovereign state again in 1948. 1948, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. How long is a generation in the Bible? 40 years. 1948 plus 40, bingo, 1988. So there it is. He had 87 other reasons like this. And they all added up to 1988. Some people, even evangelical Christians, were not happy with this, and they pointed out to Whisenant, look, Jesus says, no one knows the day or the hour when the end will come. And Whisenant replied, that's completely right. I don't know the day or the hour. I just know the week. and so it goes. Well, of course, it didn't happen that year. A lot of my students were upset with me that I said, yeah, it's not going to happen. I had one student whose parents literally sold the farm because this book was in wide circulation. There were 2 million copies of this book circulated. 2 million, largely in the South, but not only in the South. And people were buying this because they thought it was probably right. Well, it didn't happen. So what happened then? Well, what happened then is what normally happens in these situations. Whisenant wrote another book, arguing that he had been off for a year. In fact, it's 1989. But he had a good explanation, because he had forgotten that when we came up with our current calendar, people go from 1 BC to 1 AD in the calendar. The calendar does not have a year zero. And so the first decade is actually only 9 years long. And so he's off by a year. I blew that. Okay, but it's 1989 for sure. And so it goes. Right. Well, so that was how I got welcomed to Chapel Hill. It was a very, very interesting time. And the thing is that Whisenant isn't the only one who's doing this kind of thing. When I was an undergraduate in the 1970s, we all, when I was an evangelical Christian, we all were very taken with the writings of Hal Lindsey. Hal Lindsey, a lot of you will know about this book. It's called The Late Great Planet Earth. The Late Great Planet Earth. It was the best-selling book of the 1970s, the best-selling nonfiction book apart from the Bible. The best-selling nonfiction book of the 1970s was The Late Great Planet Earth in the world, in the English-speaking world anyway. It predicted also that Jesus was going to return sometime in the 1980s, and that we didn't have long before the rapture happened. And Lindsay worked out an entire scenario of what the end times was going to entail, that Israel was going to assume control of the Temple Mount, and that Russia would get nervous about Israel asserting its power, and there was going to be a war in the Middle East. So Russia then will invade. He's basing this on biblical prophecies. And then Russia will invade, and then there will be a 10 country European Union that comes in to counter Russia's attack. And then the Chinese will get involved, and then the bombs are going to start flying. And right before the destruction comes, Jesus returns. So, and these authors, both of these authors, assure us that they're not making this up. They're just reading their Bibles. The Bible says this. You won't be surprised to know that the book of Revelation figures prominently in both of these books. More recently, we have the Left Behind series that you probably have heard of. Maybe many of you have read it, starting in the 1990s, 1995, a long series of novels about Jesus coming back and taking people out of the world before all chaos breaks out. And the novels are about what's happening when the chaos is breaking out. There are something like 68 million copies of this thing that have been sold, of the series. 68 million copies sold. It's mind-boggling. And most people who buy these books, of course, simply think that he's telling us what's in the Bible. Right. Well, the thing is that every time somebody writes one of these books, people get excited, but the end doesn't come. The clock keeps ticking, as we all noticed. These all are doomed predictions of doom, and all of them have three things in common. One is all of these books, the best-selling books, have all made their authors incredibly wealthy. Moreover, they've all been inconvertibly wrong. I mean, they've been inconvertibly wrong. And third, they are inevitably based on the book of Revelation, largely based on the book of Revelation. And so my question is, what is the problem here? Is it that somebody's like making a minor miscalculation? There are lots of these books being published still today by conservative evangelicals, and especially by fundamentalist Christians, who assure us they're just reading the book of Revelation. And they always assure us that the people who previously got this wrong is because they made a miscalculation. They misread this verse. What the verse really means is, and then they give and say, so they were all wrong and they shouldn't have done that. But this is what's really going to happen. That happens time and time again. My thesis in this talk is that the reason these predictions have always been wrong is not because there was a minor miscalculation someplace. It's because the entire method of interpreting the book of Revelation is wrong. It is not what the book of Revelation is all about. The book of Revelation is not predicting what's going to happen in our near future. This is the view of historians generally who approach the New Testament from a historical point of view. It is not as sensational, as scintillating as thinking, it's going to come next Thursday, but it appears to be the more responsible way of approaching the book of Revelation. In this way of approaching the book of Revelation, scholars try to understand the book of Revelation in light of other books like it in its day. In other words, they consider seriously the genre of the book of Revelation. So let me explain what I mean by that. Every kind of writing fits into some kind of genre. And so you have a short story, and there are certain characteristics of short stories. And the characteristics of short stories are very different from characteristics of an epic poem. And an epic poem is very different from a limerick. And a limerick is very different from a contemporary novel. And so all of these are ways of writing. And these ways of writings, it's not that they're written in stone, you have to do it in a certain way, but the way you write something guides the expectation of your readers. So that if you're reading something and you know what the genre is, you know how the book works. And if you don't know how the book works, you're not going to understand the book. just as an example, suppose you're reading a story. You're reading a story that says that some scientists in New York have been experimenting with some kind of very, very deadly bacterium, and it gets out of the laboratory and gets into the water supply in New York City. Now, if you're reading that in a science fiction novel, it's fine. You basically know what's going to happen now and what's going to happen next. But if you read it on the front page of the New York Times, you've got a different way you read this because it's a different genre, and you know how both of these genres work. Historians who approach the Bible try to understand the genre of all of its writings, including the book of Revelation. Revelation seems very weird to us because those of us who read it, many people don't read it because they're too afraid of it, but many people who do read it think, whoa, this is very strange. I've never seen anything like this before. And that's right, most people haven't, but in fact, historians have. There are lots of books like that that were being written at the time by both Jews and Christians. For example, the Old Testament book of Daniel, and then 3 books not in the New Testament, but 1st Enoch, 4th Ezra, 2nd Baruch. These are all books like the book of Revelation, and they help us understand how books like this are supposed to work. So how do ancient apocalypses work? If you know how ancient apocalypses work, then you'll know how this particular apocalypse is supposed to work. That's the theory, and it works pretty well, actually. So, ancient apocalypses. Ancient apocalypses had several characteristics. First of all, they are first-person prose narratives of visionary experiences. So, in other words, somebody's writing in the first person, and they're recounting the visions they've had. Wild visions, bizarre visions. There are basically 2 kinds of these apocalypses. Some apocalypses have the author having a heavenly journey. They're taken up into the heavenly realm, and they look around and they see what's happening in the heavenly realm, and it explains what's happening on earth. Because earth is kind of a reflection of what's happening up there. And so when you see what's happening up there, this nonsense down here starts making sense. You realize, oh, that's why it's working that way. The other way you have apocalypses is sometimes you have futuristic visions, where somebody will be given a vision of what's going to happen in the future. It's usually a symbolic vision of some kind that's trying to teach a lesson. And so sometimes you get futuristic visions, sometimes you have heavenly journeys, and the book of Revelation actually is both. He has a heavenly journey that is a prediction of what's going to happen. Okay. Normally, these books are pseudonymous. The author usually claims to be some famous person in the past. You claim to be Daniel, who was a famous ancient Israelite, or you claim to be Abraham or Moses. We have apocalypses by all these people. We have an apocalypse by Adam, as in Adam and Eve. And so that, he didn't really write it. None of these people really wrote these books, but they're famous people who are spiritual people, and who better to get a revelation from God about the reality of of everything than somebody who's famously spiritual. They're normally pseudonymous. The book of Revelation is not pseudonymous, interestingly. It's one thing that makes it different from these other books. We have some others that are not pseudonymous. They contain bizarre symbolism. That's to be expected. And the way to understand the books is to know how to interpret the symbolism. They ultimately have very similar messages. Their messages are that God ultimately is transcendent, and reality, since God is the ultimate source of reality, reality makes sense only when you understand it from the overall picture. Transcendence is where meaning lies, not in immanence, not where we are now. Where we are now doesn't make any sense. Look around. This world doesn't make sense. But if you have a transcendent view, so these apocalypses are all about getting a transcendent view in which God is ultimately sovereign. Many people think that it doesn't look like God is in charge. Massive starvation in our world, wars, earthquakes, tsunamis, famine, epidemics. God's in charge? What would it be like if he wasn't in charge? So apocalypses are written to explain, look, it doesn't look like he's in charge. He is in charge. And the apocalypses explain it by their visions. God really is sovereign. And good will ultimately triumph. Good will triumph. You may be on God's side now, and you may be suffering for it. You may be being persecuted. You may be doing what's right and getting no rewards for it. You might be hungry, no way to feed your family. You might have economic problems. You might be sick. There might be horrible things happening to you, but God is on your side. If you're a good person, God is on your side, and ultimately you are going to triumph. And so, in some senses, these books are meant to provide hope for those who are suffering. Hope for those who are suffering, that it's going to be okay. But I put a question mark after hope for reasons we're going to see at the end of the lecture. Because the triumph of some in these books leads to the destruction of others, and in these books, the torture and destruction of others. And so it's hope for me with a question mark. But that's for you to decide. Let me talk specifically about the book of Revelation and try to show how it is that kind of book, an apocalypse. So we have pretty good idea when and where not where this book was written, but well, pretty good idea. It's written by somebody named John, calls himself John. He doesn't say that he is the son of Zebedee, the disciple of Jesus. He doesn't claim to be one of Jesus' disciples. In fact, gives hints that he's not. Indicates he's not one of the disciples. He indicates that he's on the island of Patmos, which is a little island off the west coast of Turkey that you can still visit today. In fact, if you're a tourist, you'll go there and you'll see the place where John allegedly had these visions and wrote this book. It's almost certain that John is writing at the end of the first century, in the 90s, 95 or so. And so that would be maybe 65, 70 years after Jesus' ministry. And so much later than Jesus. He's writing in Greek. And so he is a Greek-speaking Christian living, 7 decades or so after Jesus' ministry. He has a number of visions, and his book records the visions. And so what I would like to do now is give you an overview of what happens in the book of Revelation, because I think it's probably safe to assume that many of you have not read it in recent history or maybe ever, and maybe don't really remember what's in it, or ever knew what was in it. And so I want to just give an overview of the action. And so the main action. It's not that hard of a book to get a handle on in terms of the sequence of events. What's hard is figuring out how to interpret it. In terms of the sequence of events, the author starts out by introducing himself. He says he's writing to 7 churches that are in Western Asia Minor. That would be Western Turkey. And so the church of Ephesus and Smyrna and Thyatira and Laodicea, etc. He's got 7 churches. So he apparently is somebody who was a leader in these churches, maybe a prophet in these churches, and he's exiled maybe for Christian reasons. He's been exiled for his faith, and he's writing back to these churches. And so that's his audience. They're people who know him, and he's writing to these 7 churches. And the first thing he says is that he had a vision of Christ. He was on a Sunday, he went into some kind of ecstatic state, and he saw Christ. Christ is described as one like a son of man. The Son of Man is a divine figure in the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 7. He sees Jesus as this divine figure. He's wearing a white robe with a golden sash that suggests that he's a royal being. He's the king. He has eyes of flame. He can see right through you. His feet are burnished bronze. He's resplendent in glory. And so he's this powerful figure, and he has a sword coming out of his mouth. Which we learn is the word of God. The word of God. So this is an image, right? Jesus is not really going around heaven with a sword coming out of his mouth. This is an image, but in the image, he's being portrayed as somebody who speaks forth the word of God, and it's a powerful word that is like a sword, two-edged sword. Okay, so he has this vision of Christ, and Christ tells the prophet that he has a task for him. He's to write down everything that he's seen, and everything that is, and everything that will be. And in some ways, that's kind of a structure of this book. So what has been, what he is the thing he's seen, the vision that he's just described. What is happens in the chapters 2 and 3. Where he writes to the 6 churches he's addressing. He writes letters to each one to describe their situation. So that's what is the current state of the church. And then chapter 4 to the end, all the way through chapter 22, 4 through 22 is what will be. He's describing what he sees as the future. Okay, so you have the vision of Christ, you have the letters to the 7 churches. These 7 churches, Christ actually dictates letters to John, and John writes these letters. So he writes a letter to Ephesus, the Christians in Ephesus, and a letter, to the Christians in Smyrna and the Christians in Laodicea, and he writes these letters. Usually Christ will sometimes Christ will praise the church. You're doing well. You've kicked out all the false teachers. You are standing up against persecution. He praises them sometimes. Even when he praises them, he ends up saying, yeah, but you've got this problem and you better solve it. Some churches he doesn't praise very much. It's all about the problem. You're following this teacher, this Christian teacher who doesn't know what she's talking about, and you better change your ways or you're going to be in trouble. you're going to be losing your salvation if you don't change your ways. Or you become apathetic to the message. You're no longer inspired to do your evangelism. You need to get back with the program. So chapters 2 and 3 are these letters to the 7 churches. They're very important because they show that the enemies of Christ in this book are not only the forces of evil you would think about. There are people who think that they are followers of Jesus in the churches, and this message is written for them. So it's an important message for people living in the churches at the time. After the letters to the 7 churches, we get into what most people think is the real action. In chapter 4, he's finished his letters. John has a vision. He looks up to heaven and he sees there's a door in the sky. And he hears a voice that says, "Come up." And so he shoots up through this door, this window, and he goes to the throne room of God. He's in the heavenly place where God dwells, and he sees God sitting on his throne, and God looks like this sparkling jewel, and the throne is fantastic, amazing, and it's like this sea of glass in front of him, like crystal, and he's got 4 living beings around the throne who are worshiping God day and night, and 24 human elders around the throne who are worshiping God day and night, who have golden crowns, and it's this amazing scene, and thunder and lightning are coming from the throne. It's a spectacular scene. In the next chapter, after he sees the throne room of God, he sees that the figure sitting on the throne is holding a scroll. Now, in the ancient world, they didn't have books like we have, that you turn the page and you read on both sides of the page. They had scrolls, which were rolled up and you write on one side. And this scroll was sealed, we're told, with 7 seals. The scroll was sealed with 7 seals. Some of you might remember, I remember back when I was in junior high, some kids would get like these little wax things that you would seal a letter with, and you'd put a little stamp on it, and that's how you'd seal the letters. Some people thought that was cool. This is what happened in the ancient world. If you're sending a message to somebody, you would seal it. And if you were a state official, you would seal it with your official ring, and nobody could open it. Nobody could break the seal unless it was somebody that it was sent to, or someone who was of equal authority to the person who gave the stamp on it. So the prophet sees God holding this scroll with 7 seals on it, and he realizes there is nobody worthy to break the seals, and he gets very upset, and he starts to weep. But an angel standing by him, by the way, in these apocalypses, almost invariably in these apocalypses, the author is going to be describing bizarre things, but he's always going to have an angel next to him explaining them to him. That's very convenient, especially for the reader. And that's what you got here. So the angel explains, actually, there is one who can break the seal, the Lion from the tribe of Judah. Jesus was thought to have come from the tribe of Judah. He's sometimes described as a lion. The author, John, starts looking for a lion to show up. He doesn't see a lion, though. He sees a lamb as if it has been slain. The lamb, as if he's been slain, is clearly a reference to Christ, who is portrayed in, say, the Gospel of John as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Christ's sacrifice as a lamb is what brings salvation. He has an image of Christ, who isn't a lion, but he's a lamb, and he's a slain lamb. And he realizes that the lamb is able to break the scrolls. In other words, the lamb has as much authority as God himself, and the scroll is handed over to the lamb, and he starts breaking the scrolls, breaking the seals. This is when, disasters start breaking out. It's sealed with 7 seals. Every time the lamb breaks a seal, something horrible happens on earth. He breaks the first seal, and the first 4 seals are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. One after one, a horseman appears on different colored horses. The first horseman appears, and he's conquering people on earth. He's bringing war to the earth. So these seals have war, and they have famine on the earth. They have drought. They have terrible things are happening, and people are dying all over the map. And it goes through like this with all 7 seals. You get to the 6th seal, and when the lamb breaks the 6th seal, the sun turns dark, the moon turns to blood, the stars fall from the sky rolls up like a scroll, and obviously you think, oh my God, the world now has ended, right? Wrong. You're only in chapter 6. You've got 16 more chapters of this. When he breaks the 7th seal, so, okay, a point about all of this, a very important point that was recognized even by readers in the ancient world. You cannot line up the events in the book of Revelation sequentially and have a chronological, linear account of what's going to happen. The world's ended here at the end of chapter 6 with the 6th seal, but it keeps on going. Why? Because these are not chronological descriptions. This will happen, and that, and that, and that. They are disasters that happen over and over and over again, not because the same disaster is going to happen over, but because it's emphasizing, it's making emphatic that this is really going to happen. And so it's repetition for effect, not to set out a linear sequence of what's going to happen. When he breaks the 7th seal, we're introduced to 7 angels who have 7 trumpets. Each one blows a trumpet. And every time the trumpet happens, people get killed, and disasters happen, and wars and earthquakes, and this horrible things are happening all over the earth. The 7th trumpet blows, and it introduced 7 angels who are carrying bowls of God's wrath. And one by one, they pour over these bowls on the earth, and disasters are taking place everywhere. It's crazy. And it goes like that. Included in these, the time of these bowls of wrath being poured out, we are introduced in chapter 13 to the main enemy of God who has to be overthrown. An enemy who is called the beast. Often people talk about this enemy as the Antichrist. The term Antichrist is not used in the book of Revelation. The beast is not called the Antichrist, but this is an Antichrist figure. And one of the keys to understanding the book will be understanding who is this Antichrist figure, the beast, who is, in one place we're going to look at in a minute, also called Babylon the Great. Eventually, things get really nastier. They're already nasty, they get nastier on earth. And finally, the beast decides to make war on heaven and gathers together his troops and decides to attack the heavenly realm. Christ appears on a horse from heaven and destroys the beast and all the forces of evil and brings in a good kingdom. The city of God appears on earth. The city of God is the New Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem descends from heaven after the destruction of God's enemies. The city of God is enormous. It is 1,500 miles square. So it goes from what? New York to Wichita, Kansas, and from Miami to Montreal. That's the square size of the city. It's made of jasper. Its street is made of gold. The walls are jasper. The street itself is pure gold with a street of gold, and it is fantastically opulent, more than you can imagine. 1,500 miles of this on either side. So, and then it's happened. And so now the saints enter the city. There's no more evil in the world. God wipes away every one of their tears, and they live forever. And the prophet ends by saying what he actually had said at the beginning several times, that this is going to happen soon. 4 times at the end, he says, this is going to happen soon. And that's the book. A short synopsis of it. So what in the world's going on here? What is this book actually about? The key, as I said, is interpreting the bizarre imagery. People who predict that this is indicating what will happen in our near future typically argue that the imagery is pointing forward to something in our own day. Consistently, different images for different things in our own day. And some authors stress that that the deal is that the ancient author, John, was seeing things that were going to happen in the 21st century. And like he didn't know what they were, so he described them as best he could. And so he comes up with these images because he's just using what he knows to describe something he doesn't understand. Let me give you an example. The flying locusts. This is interesting. These are nightmare locusts that this author sees. The fifth angel, the fifth angel is blowing his trumpet. He sees a star that falls from heaven to earth. The star is given a key to the shaft of the bottomless pit, and he opens the shaft of the pit, and from the shaft, something like smoke comes out. Then from the smoke come locusts on the earth, and they have the authority of scorpions on the earth. So this is not good. They were told not to damage the grass of the earth or any green growth or any tree, but only those people who don't have the seal of God on their foreheads. Only the followers of Jesus are sealed with God. Everybody else has the seal of the beast. And so the Christians don't suffer in this. These locusts are allowed to torture people for 5 months, but not to sting, but not to kill them. Their torture is like the torture of a scorpion. People will seek death, but not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. And then he describes the scorpions. In appearance, the locusts were like horses equipped for battle. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair, their teeth like lions' teeth. They had scales like iron breastplates, and the noise of their wings like the noise of many chariots with horses rushing into battle. They had tails like scorpions with stingers, and in their tails was the power to harm people for 5 months. What in the world is this? Well, Hal Lindsey, in one of his later books, The Apocalypse Code, after the Great Planet Earth didn't happen, in the Apocalypse Code, he explains what this is. So you get locusts. These locusts are like horses equipped for battle. They have something like crowns of gold with human faces, hair like women's hair, teeth like lions' teeth, sound like Russian horses. What is this? These are attack helicopters, modern attack helicopters, which look like scorpions, kind of. And crowns of gold, because the pilots are wearing helmets. Why does it have faces like human faces? Because the pilots are looking through the windscreen, through the window. And so you see the face of the pilot, so they got human faces. Hair like women's hair, well, the rotor's going around and it's wispy like hair. And teeth like lion's teeth, there's a 6-barrel cannon coming out from the front that looks like teeth. Sound like many horses, this is the thunderous sound of the rotors. This is the explanation then. The author has seen future attack helicopters. It's a clever interpretation. There's no doubt about it. And it completely fails because Lindsey doesn't remember or note what these locusts do. They are not allowed to kill anybody. Their sting doesn't kill anyone. It tortures them for 5 months, and people are desperate to die, but they can't. What kind of attack helicopter doesn't kill anybody? And so, so like, it doesn't seem to work. Usually these explanations, in fact, almost every time, these explanations just don't work when you actually look at the text. And so I recommend looking at the text. Let me explain 2 other images that are with a different interpretation. My interpretation is going to be based on the idea, that's a very common idea among historians and scholars, that when somebody in the ancient world was writing a book, they were writing it for their own audience and not for some other audience. So that if you want to understand what their audience understood, meaning you want to have some understanding of what the author might have had in mind, it really helps to know what they would make of it in their own world. And so I'm going to talk about two passages: the whore of Babylon in chapter 17, and then the beast himself in chapter 13. So the whore of Babylon, so-called. The author hears from one of the angels who had poured out one of the seven bowls, who says, "Come, I'll show you the judgment of the great whore who's seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk." So it's calls it a great whore. The prophet doesn't know what he's going to see, and then he sees it. "So he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, okay, that was full of blasphemous name, and the beast had 7 heads and 10 horns." Okay. "The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup." Holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her fornication. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery: Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. What in the world is this? Well, the author can't figure it out. And so the angel standing next to him tells him what it's about, but again, doesn't come out and say it. He gives some symbolic language. Who or what is this? The angelic explanation: "The waters that you saw where the whore is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages, for God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by agreeing to give their kingdom to the beast." Okay, so who is she, though? The woman you saw, the whore of Babylon, is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. Now, of course, futuristic people today telling prophecies come up with explanations about who this is representing. What is it like? Who's it representing? Well, what if we put it in the author's own historical context and try to understand it by taking the keys that are provided by the text itself? This whore is called Babylon. Babylon was a city. In the Old Testament, Babylon is the city that destroyed Israel and destroyed the temple. So the woman is called after the name, so she's a city. She is seated on this beast with 7 heads, and the 7 heads represent 7 hills. That's all most people need to figure out who the author living in the 1st century Roman Empire is talking about. What was the city built on 7 hills? Rome. The city built on 7 hills. It was called that frequently and still is. This whore is fabulously wealthy with purple, scarlet, gold, jewels, and pearls. Rome was by far the richest city in the world at the time. It was a corrupting influence in all the nations of earth with whom she commits fornication, meaning they participate with her in her foul activities and also in order also to get rich. Rome is responsible for the persecutions of Christians. Rome is drunk with the blood of the saints and Jesus' witnesses. The first Christian persecution under Nero was, Nero engaged in bloody executions of Christians. And the author knows that. And in case the reader didn't get yet who this person is, the angel then comes out and says, "The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." He's talking to somebody in the 1st century who in the Roman Empire was ruling over the kings of the earth, the city of Rome. The enemy of God, Babylon, in this book, who has to be destroyed, is the city of Rome and the Roman Empire. Okay. What about the beast from the sea? Here's a second image to talk about, the beast from the sea. This happens in chapter 13. If you know chapter 17, this one makes sense. "I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads." There we go again. "And on its horns were 10 diadems, crowns, and on its heads were blasphemous names. One of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast." Okay, well, this is Rome. Everybody's following the beast. Of course, he's only talking about the Roman Empire. "The beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, Also is allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them and given authority over everyone else. And then also causes everyone to be marked on the right hand or the forehead so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark. That is the name of the beast or the number of its name. Okay, so you've heard of the mark of the beast. People talk about this mark of the beast all the time. Lately, there are Christian fundamentalists who say that it's the vaccine shot, the mark of the beast. The author, though, gives us some indication of what he's talking about. Who is this beast? This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it's the number of a person. Its number is 666. And I put a little footnote here that you'll find in your Bibles. Some ancient manuscripts, instead of saying 666, say 616. What does this mean? What is 666? We've already seen that Rome and its rulers are the enemies of God. But the beast is 666? So there have been theory after theory after theory in the modern world. In the Second World War, it was Mussolini, or some people thought Hitler. Later, people thought that it was Saddam Hussein. Some people thought that, in fact, there was a book written when I was in college arguing that it was Henry Kissinger. People have argued for, you can do it any way, there are lots of ways to come up with this. I'll point out that there are many of my students who thought that it's very interesting that the Department of Religious Studies at UNC, that the phone number is 562, 962 5666. Is that an accident? The number of the beast. What's going on here? The author tells us that it's the number of a person. In ancient languages, they did not have a separate numeric from an alphabetical system. The alphabet was the same as the numbers, and the way you did it, if you're writing in, say you're writing in Hebrew, Aleph is the first Hebrew letter, put a little tick above it. Now it doesn't represent the letter Aleph, it represents the number 1. Beth is a 2, Gimel 3, etc. In Greek it'd be alpha, beta, gamma. When you get to 10, then the next one is the next one is 20, then 30, then 40. When you get to 100, then it's 100, 200, 300, which means every word has a numerical value because you can just add up the numbers that the letters represent. Okay. If you write the name of the first Roman emperor who persecuted the Christians, the first Roman persecutor of Christians was Caesar Nero. If you write Caesar Nero in Hebrew letters, it adds up to 666. It's interesting that you can spell Caesar Nero 2 ways. You can either say in Hebrew, you could either say the Kaiser Neron with an N on the end, or Kaiser Nero without an N on the end. The N in Hebrew is worth 50. So that if you spell it without the 50, it's 616. You spell it with it, it's 666. This is talking about Nero. The enemy, the beast, is the Roman Empire and Nero, the leader of it, or it's just symbolic, the Roman emperor is the enemy that Christ has to destroy. This is not an account of what's going to happen when Russia invades the Middle East because Israel becomes a problem in the 21st century, and then China comes in, and then the bombs start flying. This is not about what's going to happen in our future. The author is saying that the problem in his world, the big problem is the Roman Empire. They oppose the Christians. They exploit all peoples of earth. They're an economic powerhouse that is fabulously wealthy by getting all their wealth on the back of others. And God is fed up with it, and he's going to intervene and destroy the Roman Empire. The prophet predicts this is going to happen soon, that Rome will soon be destroyed. That's his prediction. He continually says, yes, it is coming soon. What is the overarching message of the book of Revelation? Many Christians at the time of the author of Revelation believed that they were not welcome in this world, and that they were opposed by most people and opposed by the government. And the government, either on the local level or on the imperial level, was persecuting them and martyring them. John is writing a message of hope to those who are suffering. It's also a message of warning for those who are not on board. It's a warning especially to Christians who don't understand that they need to behave in proper ways now, because this is all going to come soon. Rome is going to be destroyed, and so is everyone who has sided with it. The mark of the beast means you have to agree with the Roman imperial order in order to participate economically. You have to agree with Roman policies and Roman views, which means you have to be against Christians. Christians won't do that, so they don't have the mark of the beast. They have the mark of Jesus. It's the people with the mark of Jesus who are going to survive the onslaught when God destroys Rome and all of its allies and everyone who sides with it, which is everyone except for the Christians. So that's a message of hope. But at what cost? This book is filled with divine violence. Many people say that the Old Testament portrays a God of wrath, but the God of the New Testament portrays a God of love. I often wonder when somebody says that, whether they've read the book of Revelation. You talk about a God of wrath. The term wrath appears repeatedly in Revelation with respect to God and with respect to the Lamb, whose sword coming out of his mouth literally kills most of the planet. I was going to go through some passages here. I don't think I will, but I'll just say, if you want to see some of these, look up these passages. For example, in chapter 14, where we have God's wrath being manifest against the earth, and an angel coming out from heaven who swings his sickle and destroys people. How much? So it's like the flood was blowing like wine. And look at that last verse. The winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for a distance of about 200 miles. That's a lot of blood that the angel of God is shedding because the enemies of God deserve to be destroyed. Or you have the wedding feast of the Lamb. Let me just summarize this instead of going through my slides. The Lamb is going to get married to his bride. The bride is the church. The Lamb is Christ. There's going to be a wedding feast. The angel blesses those who are going to come to this marriage supper of the Lamb. Christ appears. An angel stands in the sun and cries out to the birds in the mid-heaven, telling the birds of the sky to come to eat the kings of the flesh, the kings of the captains, the flesh of mighty, flesh of horses, flesh of all, both free and slave, small and great, everyone who opposes Christ. And then it happens. There's the final battle, and Christ destroys the beast, and the rest are killed by the sword of his mouth, and the birds are gorged with the flesh in this final battle of Armageddon. This is a very violent book showing the violence that will be played out against everyone who does not have the mark of Jesus. It doesn't matter if you're a good person, if you love others, if you take care of others, if you're kind, if you're gentle. If you participate with Rome, you will be destroyed. And eventually in this book, you'll be destroyed a second time by being cast into the lake of fire. The problem is not only the problem of violence, but also the problem of wealth. Both violence and wealth are talked about a lot by Jesus, the historical Jesus, the man Jesus. Read the Gospels. Did Jesus believe in violence? Jesus says, if somebody strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. Jesus said, love your enemy. He didn't say destroy them. He said to pray for those who are opposed to you. Is that the view of the book of Revelation? In terms of wealth, Jesus said, sell your wealth. Jesus himself had no wealth, and he was opposed to wealth. The way to get into the kingdom of heaven and to be rewarded in the kingdom is to give everything away. It's not so that you'll get more money later. The whole problem is that you shouldn't be invested in wealth. You should be invested in God, and it's the spiritual things for Jesus. The book of Revelation also has a problem with wealth, but the problem in Revelation is not wealth per se. The problem with Revelation is who's got the wealth. It's the Romans who've got it. The Christians ought to have it. And so Rome is destroyed, and the Christians are given opulence far beyond anything Rome could imagine. They are given a city of God that is pure gold, far beyond anything in Rome. That's not the message of Jesus, who did not think that material possessions is what people should be living for. Moreover, and even more important, in the book of Revelation, we have a lesson of domination. This is all about who is going to be dominant. Is it the Empire of Rome, or is it Jesus and his followers? Jesus asserts dominance over others in this book, and at the end, his followers rule the earth with a rod of iron. They are strict rulers over everyone not in the city. They are dominant. It's very interesting that Jesus himself was completely opposed to the idea of domination. It's interesting in part because this did have a very good effect on Christianity. In the ancient Roman world, people who had resources, who had money and property, were never encouraged to help those who were poor. They could help those who were equally rich or on their same social status. Christians were told to give their money to the poor. Before Christianity came along, there were not hospitals in the world. There were not orphanages. There were not charities. These things came about with Christianity because they were basic. I'm not saying that Christians are always charitable. I'm not saying that. But Jesus did teach that it's more important to serve than to be served. And that it's important to give things away to help those in need. Jesus taught that eternal life came by helping those who were desperate for help, to helping those in need. Those who did that would enter into the kingdom. You can read that in Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats. He was against domination. You're to serve others, not to be served. And so the book of Revelation is about domination. And so my question is this the gospel of Jesus? Let me emphasize, I'm not a Christian. I am not trying to propagate a particular religious view. As a historian, I wonder in what sense is the author of Revelation someone that Jesus himself would recognize as one of his followers? Or is he someone who certainly thinks he believes he worships Jesus and he thinks Jesus is the way of salvation? So that's absolutely true. But it's as if he accepts the Roman view of the world and takes the Romans out of it and puts the Christians into it, as opposed to Jesus, who appears to have thought that the world itself had to be transformed, not so that the right people would get the power and the domination and the wealth, but because those are not the things to live for. So it does make me wonder if, in fact, you can call this a book written by somebody that Jesus himself would recognize as one of his followers. So, right. That's my talk. I don't think the book of Revelation is expected. I think the book of Revelation is expecting Armageddon, but Armageddon is going to come against Rome and the enemies. What does it reveal? It reveals a rather unpleasant side of Christianity that has often taken over, that Christians are to dominate others and to use violence to do so. I don't think that's the teaching of Jesus. I'm going to stop there. We have time for questions. And we are going to go for 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and Todd is going to jump in and moderate questions for us. I'm going to stop my share. There's Todd.
Thank you so much, Bart. Thank you. We've had 60 questions in our question and answer, and I've tried to synthesize some and collect groups of questions. So I'll start there. Thank you all for your questions. If you're over on YouTube Live, continue in the comments. I've grabbed a couple of themes from the YouTube Live comments as well. But the first question that's been asked a lot is about why this particular apocalypse is selected, eventually selected for inclusion in the New Testament, and more specifically, why this one and not others.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I need to give a little bit of background. The books, the 27 books of the New Testament did not come into existence. They weren't collected right away. There were a long period of debates. I think most of my students think that, the New Testament kind of descended from the sky a few months after Jesus died, and it wasn't that way. The books are written, Jesus died around the year 30 of the Common Era. The first book Christian book we have, was written around the year 50. It's the book of First Thessalonians, as it turns out. The book about the year 50. The last book was written around the year 120. So the books that later came into the New Testament are all written between 20 and 100 years after Jesus' death. Other books were written at the time, which is what this question is alluding to. Other books were written at the time. Other gospels were written, other letters, other apocalypses. And church fathers and church leaders had to debate which books should we see as authoritative. From very early on, Christians believed that books could guide their actions because they believed the Christians inherited a Bible. Christians started out, Jesus was a Jew and his followers were Jews. They had the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. They had the Hebrew Bible. Christians then, who started believing Jesus, thought that there needed to be books that expanded it to include this way of salvation that Jesus provided. But there's so many books with so many different points of view and different understandings and different theologies and so how do we know which ones? And so they decided they've got to have a collection of some kind. The collection took a long time, and to the surprise of a lot of people, the collection was not decided by the Emperor Constantine in the year 325 or at the Council of Nicaea, despite the claims of that inimitable historian Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code. Dan Brown, and a lot of people think that. No, the first time, they didn't even talk about it at the Council of Nicaea, which books should be in. The first time anybody put our 27 books together and said, these are the books, was in the year 367 by an author named Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, Egypt. That did not solve the problem then. There continued to be debates. The book of Revelation was the last one to get in because people found it problematic for a variety of reasons. There was one other apocalypse that almost made it in. In the 4th century, there was another apocalypse that people don't know about today, but there's a fantastic book called The Apocalypse of Peter. The Apocalypse of Peter did not make it in.
Yeah, that's mentioned by a person who specifically asked about that apocalypse. So
it's a great book. It was lost for centuries, discovered in the 1880s. It's a book where an author is given the guided tour of heaven and hell and seeing people tortured forever and rewarded forever. And so it's a great book, but it didn't make it in. Why did one make it in and not the other? Eventually, the book of Revelation got in for a pretty simple reason. Church leaders became convinced that it was written by the same author as the Gospel of John, and that it was written by one of Jesus' own disciples, and therefore it was authoritative. They decided not to accept the Apocalypse of Peter because it taught an idea that they didn't like, that everybody eventually would get out of torment. And they didn't like that. So they didn't accept that one, but they did accept this one.
A kind of follow-up question has to do with the authorship of Revelation, and specifically with John of Patmos. Yeah. And if you could just say a few things about John of Patmos, what kind of definitive historical figure is he, and how you teach the divergence between John of Patmos and John, Jesus's disciple.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the answer is we don't know anything about John of Patmos from any historical source except for the book of Revelation itself. There were later discussions by church fathers early on in the 2nd century about who this John was, and was he the disciple of Jesus, John the son of Zebedee. It was almost always thought that the 4th gospel, the Gospel of John, was written by John the son of Zebedee. And so people wondered, was the book of Revelation also written by that person? In the 3rd century, interestingly, there was a prominent intellectual in Christianity named Dionysius, who is a bishop of Alexandria again, Dionysius in the 3rd century, who wrote a book. We still have it. We have a quotation of this book that definitively shows that whoever wrote the book of Revelation was not the author of the Gospel of John, because their writing styles are hugely different. And that's what scholars think today. It's a different person. And so even in early Christianity, they developed the idea that there were 2 Johns, John, the son of Zebedee, and John the elder, who was John of Patmos, the one who wrote the book of Revelation. That might be right. The interesting thing is that the Gospel of John, the author does not tell us his name and does not claim to be John, but we call that one John. Book of Revelation does claim to be written by John, probably was written by somebody named John, and we don't call that one John, we call it the book of Revelation. So it's a little bit of irony. He appears to have been a Christian. Many people think that he was a Jewish Christian because the name John was a Jewish name. So he may have been a Jewish Christian living at the end of the 1st century who understood himself to be a prophet who was connected with the churches of Asia Minor. The other thing I'll say about him is that his Greek is very bad. He makes grammatical mistakes all over the place. So he was highly educated in the sense that at least he could write Greek, but he was not a top echelon writer.
So kind of a follow-up question on this. There were a lot of questions about Christian culture at the time of the writing of Revelation, the degree to which apocalyptic, you could call it a kind of popular apocalypticism was abroad, separate from the writing that we're seeing. What do we know about that early Christian culture?
Yeah, it's very, very important. So it's a good question. When you read through the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, there's a steady refrain about why it is that this world is such a mess. And the world is such a mess because people have disobeyed God and he's punishing them. Even the people of Israel, the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Hosea, all of them have this message that people of Israel need to repent. If they don't, God will punish them. There'll be famine, there'll be drought, there'll be epidemics, there'll be military disaster, there'll be economic collapse. That will be God's punishment. About 200 years before Jesus, many Jewish thinkers started thinking, that doesn't really make sense of our situation because we're doing our best to follow God and we're still suffering. In fact, we're suffering worse than these people who are complete pagans. It doesn't make any sense. And so they developed the idea that it's not God who's creating the suffering, it's the enemies of God. And these enemies of God aren't just humans, they're also superhumans. So they started developing the idea that there's a Satan in the world. There's a devil, and he's got demons, and there are powers of evil that are taking over this world. And the apocalyptic view is what scholars call that understanding of things, that you have 2 powers, the power of God and the power of the devil, and they're fighting it out. And for now, the devil has control of this world, which is why there's so much pain and misery here. But in this apocalyptic view, there's going to come a time very soon when God gets fed up and he intervenes and destroys all the forces of evil and everyone who sides with them and brings in a good kingdom, brings people back to paradise if they followed him. This paradise will be available not only to the people who happen to be alive at the time. Everyone is going to be brought back from the dead in their bodies. And those who are righteous will be given God's kingdom, and those who are unrighteous are going to be shown the error of their ways, and they're going to be mercilessly slaughtered for all time. They'll be destroyed. And so that's the apocalyptic view. It's the view that John the Baptist had. It's the view that Jesus himself had. It's the view that Jesus' earliest followers had. It's the view that the book of Revelation has, but they all play it out in different ways, obviously.
So your answer then dovetails with another question, which is, what degree do you think that either popular apocalypticism, I mean, most of it was popular apocalypticism because, literacy and writing was extremely limited. To what degree do you think this contributed to the growth of the early church?
Yeah, so it's a very, very interesting question. And there's been some very interesting scholarship on this. And I can't go into the whole thing. I do think that it had a very significant role. I'll tell you one thing is that if you think the end's coming sometime within the next 2 weeks, and you've got family and friends that you think are going to be condemned and destroyed in a very bloody way, you're probably going to want to convert them. And so the apocalyptic thing gave some kind of urgency to the, and the Apostle Paul actually says that. He talks about the urgency of the moment. There have been some very interesting studies about what happens when expectations don't come to fulfillment. Many people in the audience, you'll know the term cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is, this theory of cognitive dissonance was come up with by a social psychologist, Leon Festinger, who wrote this book, When Prophecy Fails, which, if y'all don't know this book, this is a great book to read. It's not about the Bible per se, it's about UFO cults. And it's about how, Festinger and a couple of his colleagues infiltrated a UFO cult that was expecting that the spacemen were coming soon and we're going to take them out of the world. And they had a date for when it was going to happen. And the sociologists were doing this because they were interested in trying to figure out what's going to happen to these people when it doesn't happen. Like, you know, you'd think, well, okay, they'd realize they're wrong and they go off to do something else. So they were in these groups, they had the date didn't happen. And some people said, forget it. A lot of people, though, became more committed to their beliefs. They reset the date and they became more evangelistic, trying to convince more people that in fact they were right, that the new date's going to happen. And so that's the opposite of what you would expect, but it's called cognitive dissonance because you've got a belief, in your head. It's a cognitive belief and it can be disproved. When it is disproved, what happens? Well, you suffer this dissonance, like it's, oh my God, you're confused. But the way to resolve that psychological problem is you convert more people to think like you do. And if you got a lot of people agreeing with you, then you think, I probably am right, even though you just proved wrong. And so there have been historians who tried to apply that to early Christianity, who said they expected Jesus to come back right away. He didn't come back right away. It created cognitive dissonance and it made them more missionary. So it's a very, very interesting idea.
There's a question related to this, which is, when do we start to see historical evidence of Christians trying to bring about the apocalypse that is in the book of Revelation? Like, how long does it take for the book of Revelation to become a kind of blueprint or canon for popular responses and popular behavior?
It's a really, really good question. In the early church, it was widely thought that this is going to happen and there's nothing we can do to facilitate it. When in the 4th century, Christianity grew and grew and grew and began to take over the Roman Empire. When the Emperor Constantine converted in the year 312 to Christianity, he became the first Christian emperor, and virtually all the emperors after him were Christian. And Christianity, exploded. By the end of the 4th century, half the empire was Christian. By the end of the 5th century, most of the empire was Christian. There developed an idea at that point that the kingdom of God is not going to come in the sense that there's going to be a literal destruction of the world order, and there's going to be a literal millennium that comes and a literal city of God. As Christianity takes over the Roman Empire, they started thinking that the book of Revelation was symbolic of the destruction of pagan Rome by the Christian message. Christ destroyed Rome, not in a literal Armageddon, but by the conquest of the church. And so when you get to church fathers like St. Augustine in the early 5th century, he's quite adamant that in fact, that the church is living in the millennium now, and they need to live up to it, but there's not going to be this futuristic thing. Every now and then, though, within Christianity through the Middle Ages, you would have people who thought that in fact it's literal and it's going to happen, and we're going to get ready for it, and it involves destroying the enemy, as God's going to do at the end. We're going to start doing now, and so there are movements like that. If anybody's interested in that, there's a book by Norman Cohen called Pursuit of the Millennium that talks about these groups throughout the Middle Ages that in fact were trying to bring in the kingdom that way. And so in the modern world, most people who believe in a literal end, that this all is going to happen, tend to be conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists. And they tend not to think that they're going to like force God's hand by engaging in warfare against the state. But there are those who do feel that. And in fact, the entire conflict with the Branch Davidians, with David Koresh, involved this way of thinking. Koresh thought that he was a fulfillment of the prophecies of Revelation, and that they're all coming to an end. So the conflict was with the FBI was one he expected, and that they welcomed.
So, Bart, that was a question about popular responses to the book and using the book of Revelation as a kind of blueprint. And I think concluding with Koresh there was really, really direct, right on. Question now about, more literate responses. When do we start seeing Christian writers commenting on the book of Revelation? And when do we start to see perhaps a dissent or a critique of the book of Revelation appearing in Christian writings?
Yeah. The first time the book of Revelation is mentioned by some other author is in around the year 150 in the writings of Justin of Rome, who goes by the name Justin Martyr, not because that was his last name, but that's what happened to him soon after that. But he mentions the book of Revelation, and it begins to be mentioned more than at the end of the 2nd century. The first commentary we have on the book of Revelation still survives. It's written by an author named Victorinus in the middle of the 3rd century. Victorinus in the middle of the 3rd century. You had a second part of that question that I forgot what it was. I was set to answer.
The question was, what kinds of commentary do we start to see from early Christian writers?
And so when they start commenting on it, there's a debate. There's a big debate between whether it's literally supposed to happen or not. And the big issue was always whether, so in the book of Revelation, I didn't go into all the details about what happens at the end, but what happens at the end is when Christ wipes out the enemy, the beast, there's a 1,000-year period where he and the martyrs rule on earth, and Satan is taken out of the way. Satan's, the power behind the throne the whole time is Satan in this book. Satan is taken out of the way. He's dumped into the bottomless pit for 1,000 years. And at the end of the 1,000 years, he's released, and there's a short time of chaos on earth before Christ finally wipes him out and throws him in the lake of fire. Early church fathers debated whether this millennium thing was meant literally or figuratively. Those who thought that it was that it's actually going to happen, there's going to be a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth with his people, were called chiliasts, spelled with a CH, C-H-I-L-I-A-S-T, chiliast, which is the Latin form of it's for millennium. Chiliasts believed in a literal thing. And most church fathers, by the time you start getting comments on it, certainly by the time you get to Augustine, think that this chiliast view, starting in the 4th century, is the problem with it is that it's completely materialistic. They think they're going to be like banqueting in the kingdom of God, and everybody's going to be eating a lot and drinking a lot and having a great time. And these church fathers are turning toward more of an ascetic understanding of Christianity, that the point of existence is not to indulge the body, but to be removed from the body. And so they thought that these chiliasts, who are emphasizing the glories of the coming kingdom, were getting it completely wrong. That in fact, and so most of the commentary is written against that view, but that shows that if they feel like they've got to argue against that view, it shows that it's a pretty dominant view. And my guess is that people who weren't among the literary elite kind of liked this idea that there's going to be this millennium coming
in. A really straightforward question, maybe not so straightforward, but it's coming up a lot in the chat and question and answer. When do scholars date the book of Revelation to? Do we have a sense of its historical?
So the first person to give us a date is the church father Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century, who says that it was written during the end of the reign of the emperor Domitian. Domitian reigned until 96 CE, 96 of the Common Era, and so Revelation was traditionally dated to 95 or 96. There have been scholars and non-scholars who've argued for an earlier date, in part because Nero seems to be the enemy. And Nero committed suicide in 68. And so if Nero's the enemy, is probably earlier, right? And it talks about the temple functioning, and the temple was destroyed in the year 70. So it makes better sense that it's 68. And so there's a small debate among scholars, because there are scholars who think that it's earlier. The vast majority think that it's later, for a variety of reasons. I'll give you one. Rome is given the name Babylon. As I said, Babylon was the awful city, the enemy of God's people, because it destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in the year 586 BCE. The reason you call Rome Babylon is because it also destroyed the temple and Jerusalem in the year 70. And so it makes sense to call it Babylon only after it's done the thing that Babylon did. And so that's why scholars think 70. And then there are a number of other reasons for thinking, it's not really early in the tradition. It's probably toward the end of the first century. So almost everybody, with more arguments than that, dates it to around the year 95 or so.
So this leads to another question that's been asked a bit in the comments and chat, and that's, what are the predecessor texts to Revelation? Can you talk about the linguistic evidence that this is built on a previous Jewish apocalypse, or perhaps even earlier linguistic clues that we might use to think about where this book emerged from?
Yeah, all right, so there's kind of a two-part answer to this. One is that the ideas of Revelation are largely built on earlier Jewish sources, especially the book of Daniel. He borrows a lot of his imagery from the Old Testament book of Daniel, from the book of Ezekiel, and there are these other Jewish apocalypses that I mentioned that were earlier than Revelation. So many of the ideas, the motifs, some of the images are built from that. But I think what this question is asking is something a little different, which is, what about, is this book, is it based on earlier Christian sources, or even other Jewish sources that were Christianized by this author? That's a popular view among some people, but it's not very popular among the major scholars of Revelation tend not to think so. It looks like the book has a literary unity. The literary style, as I indicated, is not good. A few years ago at UNC, I taught a class in the classics department on New Testament Greek. And I gave as one of the assignments, I had them read Revelation chapters 1 and 2 and list all the grammatical mistakes. Because they're like flat out the grammatical mistake. He's not a good writer. And that's fairly consistent throughout. And some parts, some verses he does okay, but other not so well. There appears to be a literary unity in this book, that it's structured in a way that makes it look like it's a unit. Some people have argued that the first 11 chapters or so are based on a non-Christian Jewish apocalypse. I absolutely don't think so, and there really aren't very many people who think that anymore, because it's been shown that it's very Christian all the way through. And the consistency, both of style and theme, suggests that, in fact, it's this author John sitting down and writing. Some have thought, though, that maybe he did this in stages. Like maybe some of this stuff was written during the reign of Nero, before he's an old man, and then, the rest, he did it over time. And so that would explain some of the image issues. But that, not too many people buy that either. Most people think it's a unity.
Or feel free to let me know which is the last question, or when you're ready.
I'll give you a couple more minutes here, then we'll, yeah.
There's a question about gender and the figure of women in the book of Revelation. A question asking you to comment on, how the figure of women is operating there, and what part of that is still informing contemporary Christian culture.
Yeah, it's a very real problem. And there have been some very, very important gender analyses of the book of Revelation. Some written by feminist New Testament scholars. Some, the gender issue is very real. You have the whore of Babylon, for example. The main enemy of Christ in chapters 2 and 3 in the churches of Christ is a woman prophet that he names Jezebel, that is a Christian prophetess whom the author thinks is preaching the wrong message. Apparently she's saying that it's okay to participate with pagans in their own religious ceremonies, probably as a way to kind of making common cause with them, so you could convince them of the superiority of your view. But in author John's view, this is committing sexual immorality with these other gods. And so he says that Jezebel, this woman, is a fornicator and an idolater, and Christ threatens to throw her on the bed and to have the nations of the earth rape her. It is not a pleasant image. And so there are gender analyses of the book. As everyone probably on this Zoom knows, the Book of Revelation, the author is living at a time where women were very restricted in what they could do, and by any modern standard were completely oppressed in most ways. And so he's participating in that culture rather than being liberated from that culture. And one might ask, whether this is, again, I mentioned a few ways in which this is different from the historical Jesus. Many people have made the case that Jesus had a more open view about women. If anybody wants to read about this, there are a couple of books that I'd suggest. One is written by Tina Pippin. I forget the name of it, but it's Pippin. It's a gender analysis of Revelation. The other is written by one of UNC's graduate students, Chris Freilingus, who was my student, who wrote a fantastic book that's published on the Book of Revelation, that's called Spectacles of Empire, where he does a gendered analysis of it. Spectacles of Empire. He was one of our truly brilliant students who teaches now at Michigan State University. Todd, I'll take one more question and then I'll give it. Then I'll say a final word.
Great. This is a question about genre and what you said at the beginning of the talk, that to understand this book, you really need to be familiar with the genre of apocalypses.
Yeah.
And the question is about the kind of boundaries of that genre. And so, for example, the attendee asks, could we think of Dante's Inferno as an apocalypse? What are the boundaries of this genre?
Right. Again, it's a much disputed question. And scholars have spent a lot of time talking about it, and there are a variety of views about it. What scholars ended up doing, the consensus view about this is that the way you establish any kind of genre is you just read a bunch of books that, you read a bunch of short stories and you figure out what they've got in common, and they say, okay, that's what a short story is, and you read a bunch of novels and you realize they're different. And so you do that with the apocalypse. And so there are various criteria people have. And I gave some of them. The first person narratives about visions that are either of the other world or of the future, usually pseudonymous, that have lots of repetition in them, that go from disaster to triumph, where the good ends up triumphing in the end. And so there's a whole series of things that involve both content and form that people use to apply to this. And by those criteria, Dante's Divine Comedy, obviously it has a lot of similarities because it's a visit to the realms of the dead, but it wouldn't pass muster by these stricter definitions of what kind of criteria you would need. Those are all the questions I'm going to be able to take. Let me say just two things first before the main thing is, if you enjoyed this, actually three things. If you enjoy this kind of talk, if you enjoy this kind of stuff about early Christianity and the New Testament, I do want you to know about my blog. Just look up Bart Ehrman blog. I talk about this kind of stuff all the time. I post 5 times a week, and I answer everybody's questions I ever get on this blog. So if you have questions, you can come on the blog. So just look up the Bart Ehrman blog, and you can see what that's all about. Second thing is, if you enjoy this kind of talk about religion, religious studies, are you going to announce this, Todd, or am I announcing it? But Carl.
Announce it, Bart. I'm going to announce it.
Okay. Well, pay attention to what Todd tells you. We got another one coming up. It's going to be fantastic. So the third thing is, please remember that this and the next one are fundraisers for our department. We are training graduate students to acquire this kind of knowledge that we think is really important and that most people simply have no access to. We're helping them become experts in all sorts of areas of religious studies. So, people in New Testament, early Christianity, people in Islam and in Buddhism in various parts of the world, and different kinds of Christianity in the Caribbean or in Europe, and the history of Christianity and the history of Judaism. And it's like, we have people are teaching a wide range of stuff that's all of it's really, really important to our culture and history. We're training our students to do that, and we're training them to communicate it. This fund that we're using is helping them learn how to communicate. So we would really appreciate as much of a donation as you can make. So I'd like to thank you for participating in this, and I will hand it over to Todd for the final word.
Right. Thank you so much, Bart. We hope you can do another event like this in the near future, either here or on your YouTube channel, which has gotten a great response during today's stream. Our next event in our fundraising series for our graduate students is Dune and Islam: How to Understand the Movie. We'll be hosting it on November 13th, Saturday, more or less around this time, 3 p.m. It'll be 3 weeks after the worldwide premiere of a new movie adaptation of Frank Herbert's novel Dune. Herbert's books and films were inspired by Islam and Islamic themes as part of the core of their storytelling. Dune and Islam will feature Professor Carl Ernst, a leading scholar of Islamic studies and Sufism, and Michael Muhammad Knight, a leading scholar of the intersection of Islam and popular culture. We'll drop the link to the registration for this event in the chat, and we hope that you will join us for that. Again, that'll be on November 13th. So please consider registering. I want to thank the people that made this event possible: Professor Barbara Ambrose, the department chair in the Department of Religious Studies here at UNC; Tracy Cave, our department manager; Corey Sanders with UNC's Information and Technology Services; Joanna Smith, PhD candidate in religious studies, who many of you saw her working hard behind the scenes in the chat, responding to your questions and dropping links; and Catherine Banis, who is with UNC's Development Office. And of course, more than anything, I want to thank Bart. If you still want to give, or you're still thinking about it, you'll receive a survey at the end of this webinar, and also a follow-up email, and you'll have another chance to give it the link then. So again, thank you all so much. It's been wonderful to have this kind of response and this kind of attendance, and thank you, Bart.